Hello, hello, and good afternoon, and welcome to the Juniper Center Thrive Live, where we have conversations with guests to help therapists and really everyone else to have conversations about mental health. We are out to normalize having conversations about your mental health, just like you would your physical health. Our show typically runs every first Friday of every month, but we're so glad to do this today. This is a special edition of the Juniper Center Thrive Live in recognition of Juneteenth. So Juneteenth is a contraction of June and 19th. It celebrates June 19th, 1865, the day that all slaves were finally officially released from slavery. So I want to read very quickly to everyone General Order number 3. This was that the people are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, which was the Emancipation Proclamation, it was when the 13th, had the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which really freed all the slaves. But the story was that the folks down, the slaves and the slave owners down in Texas just didn't even know that this had happened. And that we had to wait until word got there. Well, actually, the problem was that nobody was there to enforce it. So here was what the order was when it finally arrived with the Union troops 2.5 years after the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. The people are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them become that of employer and hired labor. The freed are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So even when they were being freed, they were still being told exactly what to do and told that they were going to be hired labor. So the whole thing, it's kind of a sordid story unto itself. But thank goodness at this point, the slaves were finally legally free. So I'm so excited today to have this conversation with two very well-respected, much appreciated colleagues. I have with me Dr. Cynthia Lubin Langtiw, who is a Haitian American licensed clinical and community psychologist, a professor of clinical psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and a volunteer psychologist and clinical supervisor with the Marjorie Kovler Center for Survivors of Torture, which is an amazing organization. She also provides training on psychological trauma for the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. And we have a second guest, someone who is near and dear to me. She works at the Juniper Center and was actually our very first ever therapist in addition to me in the practice. So this is Dr. Karen Thames. She is a licensed clinical psychologist with over 15 years of clinical experience, working with individuals, couples, and families, including with us for the last several years. She uses the not-for-profit she founded, Empowering People with Invisible Chronic Illnesses, or the EPIC Foundation, which is amazing. Please go online and look at the EPIC Foundation to help people living with invisible chronic illnesses. She sees clients from all backgrounds with a deep interest in multicultural psychology and diversity and inclusion. Thank you both, Dr. Cynthia and Dr. Karen, for joining us today. So, Dr. Karen, as we were planning this event today, you had a wonderful idea for us to observe a moment of silence in commemoration of so many people who have lost their lives as a result of racism and oppression. Would you mind leading us in that moment of silence, please?
Thank you so much. I would like to take a moment of silence for individuals who we call the Charleston Nine. 7 years ago, yesterday marked the anniversary of when a 21-year-old white supremacist entered a Black church, Emmanuel African Methodist and Episcopal Church, Episcopal Church. He joined them for a Bible study and intentionally killed them. We would like to take a moment of silence for those 9 precious individuals who lost their lives. If we can, take that moment right now. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karen. I appreciate you doing that. So I appreciate you both being here. I gave a little bit of history, and we could certainly go, on and on. And we're all psychologists. So this is also about the mental health impact of slavery and all of the trauma and history of African American folks in this country. We don't have time to get into all of that today. I mean, who does? But I would love for us just to have a little bit of conversation, maybe starting with you, Dr. Karen, about how the idea for this episode even came to be.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Dr. Margo, as you said, we've known each other for a very long time, 2 decades, over 2 decades, and it's just amazing to be here. But I am blessed to be a clinician at the Juniper Center. I am also a lead on the diversity, equity, and inclusion team. The diversity mission statement is one that really attracted me to the Juniper Center because I know that the Juniper Center really cares about serving multicultural communities. And we had a conversation around Juneteenth, and we really, as a committee, wanted to honor the day by opening up a conversation around multiculturalism, cultural identity, and mental health, so that we can address issues that are really prominent within marginalized groups and really, honor and support the community.
Oh, that's fabulous. I'm so glad you were having that conversation, and thank you. I hope that is the case, that people understand that we really do have a commitment to this. I know that it's very popular right now to be doing DEI work, and people, kind of give it some lip service, but I think that's, disingenuous at best. So hopefully folks will take it seriously and understand the need. So, Dr. Cynthia, so as people are coming together for Juneteenth, how does the fact that it's now this federal holiday, and there is kind of I hate to say a sordid story around this, but the slave owners obviously in Texas did not go quietly into the night. They did not say, "Oh, all right, the African American folks, the slaves are freed, and okay, well, God bless, and Godspeed." No, they moved to Cuba, they moved to Brazil, they shot people. I mean, trigger warning, folks, but they would rather shoot people than allow them to be free. I mean, the trauma, even around this last bastion, this last place where slavery was still running strong. And we know that even post-slavery, we know the history, right? And who writes the history. So as we think about this, it was clearly just so much trauma. Does it feel like this holiday, from a mental health perspective, addresses that trauma?
Wow, what a great question. And thank you so much for having me. So exciting to be here with you. So, does Juneteenth address the racialized trauma? I think it's a beginning. I think it's a beginning for this reason. Juneteenth as a federal holiday, right? Not all states are, following through, but Juneteenth as a federal holiday is acknowledging, right, the past and current impact of slavery, specifically on African Americans, but not just African Americans, in our entire country, right? Every single member of our union has been, was, and continues to be impacted by the institution of slavery. and the ramifications here and now today. So I think that Juneteenth is an acknowledgement of that shaky foundation upon which we were built and how we want to move forward. So I think that that acknowledgement is a beginning of taking some responsibility. And I think that I always say that we can't have a reconciliation without a reckoning. And for me, Juneteenth is the beginning. It is not the, but it's the beginning through acknowledgement of a reckoning with our past and present, right, foundation of oppression as a United States and as a union. So I think it's a beginning, but there's obviously so much more work to be done.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective, Dr. Cynthia. And I asked that question. I mean, it's kind of, it feels like a little bit of a silly question. You know, when I used to teach graduate school, I would say to people, don't ask people silly questions. How does that make you feel when they're sitting there sobbing? You know, like, how do you think that makes them feel? So it clearly, I think, to certainly to you, and it seems apparent to me that this is just the very beginning of an understanding and a reckoning, and that there's so much more to be done. And sometimes we can say, well, we put a federal holiday on it, period. Thank you. You know, hope this satisfies you now, as opposed to what needs to come next. So particularly from a mental health perspective, I'm curious what the two of you believe would be some other steps.
I can jump in. I have lots of thoughts around this one, obviously. You know, when I think about the idea of having a reckoning before we can move towards a reconciliation, I think that, you know, 2.5 years ago now, or almost, 2 years ago now, when the entire world, not just the United States, when the entire world essentially watched the murder of George Floyd. I did not watch because that's not healthy for me and my well-being. I did not let my children watch, but we knew. And that reverberated across the world. It reverberated in the Black community here in the United States, but it also reverberated with my friends in Australia and New Zealand, right? The Indigenous people there who called me and checked in on me, right? Because they too understood what that meant in terms of oppression. So I think that fast forward, right, I think a lot of folks, you know, like many organizations stopped and took stock of who they were and how they were with respect to race in particular, but broadly speaking with respect to oppression. And so I think that one of the things that we can continue to do, right, is, as you said earlier, is to not pay lip service, but to actually continue to look at policies and procedures and actions, formal and informal, that continue to oppress in our organizations, that continue to oppress in our communities, that continue to oppress in our schools, in our carceral system, that continue to oppress in all systems, and do what we can, identify small and large ways that we can continue to dismantle oppression writ large, but then specifically around racism in these different areas. So I think that that reckoning has to continue, not as words, but as action, right? And that we each need to take responsibility for that.
Right, as actions. And I'll tell you, as we have talked about this in our practice, and I've had these conversations with other folks, people feel so overwhelmed. Like, where could I even begin? What can I do? But, you know, we can write letters, we can protest, we can raise our voices, which feels scary to some people. You know, we'd like to say, well, that sounds like a great idea, but some folks realize that's still scary to do so. So in terms of us as mental health professionals, what are some things we can be doing in our communities, in our practices?
I'll jump in here. I concur, first of all, with Dr. Cynthia and you, Dr. Margo, about pro-action. I think this sounds kind of superficial to some, but I will say acknowledgement is something that I really stress when I work with clients. And it sounds like so first, you know, step level sort of action, but truly, you are dealing with folks who feel misunderstood, unheard, and unacknowledged. And I will say, for me personally, not only in my personal life, but also as a mental health professional, that was something that I struggled with, particularly as a mental health professional that deals with the intersectionality of race and, chronic illness and other things that impact people's lives, particularly invisible chronic illness, where people especially feel invisible, literally feel invisible. And so even though it sounds very superficial, many folks do not feel like their experiences have been acknowledged, including myself, during the time where we were watching the whole world deal with a very traumatic experience, as Dr. Cynthia noted. And my experience was that there were many people who did not want to acknowledge. And so we can take proaction, but to not acknowledge, I mean, I was receiving a lot of feedback where, interestingly, I was told, you need to get over this. Why don't we just move on? We live in a colorblind world right now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, it still happens today. So I think that if we can come together, and especially in the mental health community, acknowledge first and foremost, and then take proactive measures, that would be really great from a mental health perspective.
Yeah, 100%. I was speaking at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and one of the topics I was talking about, the conference was actually about working with transgender folks in the workplace and some of the legal rights, some of the legal issues that people need to be aware of. I will tell you, in this room of people, and there were psychologists, social workers, counselors, no one had heard of intersectionality. Not one person. And it's Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, isn't it, who did who developed this theory. Please, you can hop on YouTube. Dr. Cynthia, did you want to say something about that?
Oh, I can certainly jump. I have a lot to say about intersectionality, and I love that you said that word, but I want to hear what you had to say about the conference.
Well, but so the remarkable thing was I was talking about it, and somebody stopped me and said, "What is this intersectionality thing?" And I think I sort of took for granted that people know that we're having these conversations, and nothing bad on anybody who didn't know. We don't know what we don't know, but boy, we need to find out. So when you're talking about the intersection of illness and race, or gender and race, or race and sexuality and gender, I mean, there's all of these places where people's identities, particularly identities that have been historically oppressed, intersect, and how much I think the mental health community is just not aware, let alone everybody else. So Dr. Cynthia, did you want to speak a bit?
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much for that. I mean, one of the things that I do in a clinical setting with my students as a researcher is attend to the multiplicity of identities that each of us hold. Right. And when we're talking about cultural identity and mental health, I think one of the things that can be so difficult, and I'm the mother of multiracial children, and, folks try to parse out, like, we're 1/4 this, we're 1/2 this. And, I love Maria Root's work, Dr. Maria Root, a clinical psychologist who wrote the Biracial Bill of Rights. And one of the things she talks about is not being part people. Right. And when I think about intersectionality more broadly, I think about the importance that we're not part people. We're whole people. I'm wholly a woman. I'm wholly Black. I'm wholly able-bodied. I'm wholly all of these things. And I hold all of these things, right? All of these identities as part of myself. And so I think as humans, right, and certainly as clinicians, that we need to deepen the ways that we're able to see and affirm the wholeness of ourselves, of our clients, of the spaces in which we're working, and work for ways that we can see and learn more. It was several years ago, maybe 5 years ago, that I became aware of the genocide, essentially, of Black trans women in the US and across the world.
Thank you for that.
I couldn't even, as a Black woman, understand how I didn't know this about other women. And how I then didn't have a platform for saying, what on earth? How are we allowing this to happen?
Yeah.
Right? And the multiplicity of oppression that allows Black trans women to be targets, right, isn't just about Black trans women. Of course, you need to amplify their voices, amplify that community, support that community, but that the oppression against Black trans women isn't just against Black trans women, it's against all of us. Oppression is oppression against all of us and denigrates all of us, right? And this is not to silence the voice of Black trans women, it's to amplify the importance of understanding layers of oppression and the fact that if we allow oppression in any community, right, that we are allowing, right, like the very fabric of our union to be torn. I think one of the things I think about when I think about Juneteenth and the importance for all of us is that the institution of slavery was a blight for many reasons. But one of the reasons is that racism was woven from the genocide of Native American people to the anti-Asian laws that were, foundational to slavery as a foundation. It was woven into our flag, right? And so we're trying to move forward as a union with this united flag when that's being torn apart by racism itself. And so the importance of dismantling that is not just for Black people, Asian people, not just for a particular group, it's for all of us. Like we all live under oppression, right? Some people experience it more brutally. And of course, we need to amplify their voices. But Juneteenth to me is about recognizing that the institution of slavery was problematic for everyone and continues to be problematic for everyone. Although there are certain groups of folks who need to take responsibility and action in different ways, right? And so it's not absolving anybody of that or of the reckoning that needs to happen in order for reconciliation to happen. But it's saying, hey, this was not okay. And we all need to acknowledge it and together think about who's responsible, who's accountable, and what we're going to do as a nation to move forward.
Yeah, I think that's extremely well said, Dr. Cynthia. And I'll tell you, I think, Dr. Karen, you said the phrase colorblind, that we're colorblind right now, which, yes. And how many folks say, well, I don't really care. I love everybody and I accept everybody. And there is this idea that slavery impacted everybody, that it tore apart something for everybody is so hard to get across. And I can tell you as a white person, I see that all. I mean, that's, having these conversations with people and saying, please, you need to understand, A, this isn't over, B, we could go through the whole list and getting people to hear. And that conversation has changed, quite frankly. I think folks are much more open. But the idea is now, well, I am colorblind. I love you, whether you are Black or white or red or yellow, or, and then we use all this kind of language to talk about it. But getting people to hear, sometimes I feel like Horton Hears a Who, that, right? If anybody is not familiar with Horton Hears a Who, Horton was an elephant. This is a Dr. Seuss book. And Horton was the only one who could hear the Who's down in Whoville on this what was it, dandelion or a flower of some kind. And so it's all about trying to get everybody to raise their voices so that people can hear the call, so that they know that they're there. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like we need to be raising voices enough. So how do we as mental health therapists, and as humans, how do we get people to understand how to raise their voices, how to get their yap to the top? Because that's really what that final little Who did. He said, yap, it went to the top. Everybody heard it. Yay, they were saved. How do we get people to hear? So it's, how do we get them to say the yap? And how do we get people to hear the yap? And we're foot soldiers is kind of what I think of as therapists, right? We can do policy change, but we also are sitting with people all day long, having some sort of conversation. What would you suggest in terms of getting people to hear the yap?
I don't want to take up too much space, but the thing that I think about when I think about hearing is listening to that voice. And so part of it is getting really quiet, right? And thinking about like, what keeps me from hearing it, right? It's I want to move away from discomfort, or I've never had this conversation before. I wonder what's going to happen. I wonder what this person's going to think about me. And this is for both therapists, clients, humans writ large, right? And so stopping and allowing yourself to listen to that voice, that says, I wonder if there's something here. I wonder if there's more to understand. Somebody said something to me and I didn't get it, but I felt flush. I felt scared. I had a fear response. My heart was beating hard, right? I felt like I was in fight, flight, or freeze, right? Notice that. Let yourself breathe through it and listen to what that message is trying to tell you, right? Because what can happen is, and this is one of the mental health impacts, and I'm going to use this word intentionally because so many of my clients, see a lot of folks of color, use this term. They say what happens around in the world when they experience oppression and other folks are silent, it feels like it's crazy making because then they feel like they are crazy. And I use that word intentionally. It's not a word that I throw around. This is what my clients tell me. They feel like, wait, does anybody see this? Am I making this up?
It just happened? Yeah.
Right. And it feels like, and I love this term, gaslighting on the macro. Like, did I not just see that on TV? Did that just not happen in front of me? Did that man just have his foot on this man's knee on this man's neck for 9 minutes? Did we just watch that? And then 9 months later, like, we're wondering if he's going to go to jail? Like, that is gaslighting on the macro. And that's what oppression is. It's telling us we can't believe what we see, what we hear, what we feel. And so for those who have a hard time identifying with that, I would say, like with Horton Hears It, who get really quiet. Let yourself listen and move through any difficult, uncomfortable feelings. Get some support to move through those feelings, to listen to the lesson that silence wants to teach you, to listen to the lesson in the discomfort, right? One of my friends would say, don't waste that suffering, right? Like use it, squeeze all the lessons out of it. And my hope is that on the other side, you'll have a sense of, oh, okay, something a little bit different, a little bit more understanding.
Oh, I love that. Gaslighting on the macro. That's fabulous. I love that. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Dr. Cynthia. Folks feel like they're saying I'm bad. If I acknowledge my racist thoughts, my racist feelings, I'm bad, as opposed to I'm human. This is what happens. This is the garbage I was taught, and I've come at this from a very different perspective at this stage of my life. I have 2 mixed race sons, and I watch how the world treats them, and I watch how the world treats me. Oh my gosh. I mean, we could do a bunch of episodes just on that. But I will tell you that I'm so much more aware when I hear my son in particular, my older son in particular, say, did you notice there's no other people of color? There's no other Black folks. And so we now travel differently than we used to. We make very different choices than we used to because I now am paying attention. It's as simple as that. So colorblind probably means I'm just not really noticing. And maybe noticing would be really helpful in making different choices.
Yeah, and colorblind is also, I get to be colorblind. I get to not have to think of the impact of race or ethnicity because it doesn't really negatively impact me, right? Which is the definition of privilege, but that's a whole other.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Yes, it is the definition of privilege. I don't have to ever think about it. That was the other thing we talked about at this conference. I was showing there's like a coin of privilege. And I said, look, I sit up here, right? I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm, blah, blah, blah. And here's where the, other folks sit on the bottom of the coin and folks are like, wow, privilege. It's like, oh my gosh. And these are mental health professionals. So again, no bad on anybody, but so much more for people to learn. And it does not make somebody bad to not know. It doesn't make somebody bad to have feelings. It doesn't make somebody bad to need to ask a question, right? If we can give people, that's just me as a white person saying, I think if we can collectively give each other permission to have conversations and say, I did this, I don't understand that. Can you explain this to me? And, there is this thing of, well, don't make me be your teacher. But finding those safe people who, ask and say, is it okay if I ask you this question? And take a no, like, I don't really feel like getting into it right now. But that you need to be able to have those conversations. Everybody needs to be able to have those conversations. So we have just a couple of minutes left. I feel like we could go on and on and on in this conversation. I always feel, but this one in particular, I would really love it anytime both of you, either of you would be willing to come back to continue the conversation. This feels so important and you're both delightful. I would love to continue it. And I think there's something important about a white person having this conversation with people of color and being able to have honest conversations from there as well. So if ever you would be willing to come back and have that conversation with me, continue the conversation, I would so appreciate it. But for now, if anyone would like to get in touch with either of you, what are the best places for people to connect?
Thank you, Margo. Thank you, Dr. Margo. You can reach me at Karen Thames at thejunipercenter.com, where I'm a clinician at the Juniper Center, of course. And also, you mentioned earlier, thank you so much, Empowering People with Invisible Chronic Illness, or the EPIC Foundation, epictogether.org. If you want to, learn more about our work with the chronic illness community, I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
A fabulous, fabulous organization, folks. Please take a look.
Thank you.
Dr. Cynthia?
Sure. As you know, I'm a professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. You can reach me at clangtiw at thechicagoschool.edu, and of course on Twitter, knowing Langtiw, and other social media under that as well.
That's fabulous. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you all for watching. Those of you who watched us live, I've been getting some text, so I know there's a bunch of people watching live. Nobody decided to put it in the comments today, which is perfectly fine, but lots of folks watch this afterwards as well. I can't thank you both enough. I'm so glad we have this opportunity to have this beginning of Juneteenth today, to have this very beginning of something that can be an ongoing reckoning, an ongoing conversation that needs to happen. And I so appreciate the two of you coming and having it with me today. So exciting for me. Anyway, thank you all so much. We do this again the first Friday of every month. This was a very special edition. Thanks for joining us. I will hope to see you all next time. Until then, be well.